The strange thing about love is that sometimes the whole world can see it except the two people standing right inside it. The ballroom of the Caldwell Tech Winter Gala shimmered like a field of quiet stars, crystal chandeliers hanging 30 feet above the marble floor, their lights spilling across polished tables and tailored suits. Outside the glass walls, Manhattan glittered in the cold December night, the East River reflecting 1,000 city lights like scattered diamonds. Inside, nearly 400 guests filled the hall, investors, executives, journalists, and the kind of people whose watches cost more than most cars. Waiters moved carefully through the crowd carrying trays of sparkling water and champagne, their footsteps soft against the marble. At the center of it all stood Ethan Caldwell, the white billionaire CEO, whose company had reshaped half the tech industry before he turned 40. Cameras flashed every few seconds as reporters captured his smile, the confident calm of a man used to being watched. Ethan looked exactly like the magazines described him, tall, composed, dark hair trimmed perfectly, the kind of presence that made people straighten their posture without realizing why. But Ethan was not looking at the cameras. His eyes were scanning the room, moving slowly through the sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns, as if searching for something familiar in a place that suddenly felt crowded with strangers. Then he saw her. Maya Brooks stood near the edge of the ballroom beside one of the tall windows, her reflection faintly visible in the glass behind her. Her dress was simple compared to the dramatic gowns around her, a deep navy that matched the quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. Her natural curls were pinned back loosely, and the soft city lights behind the glass framed her silhouette in a way the photographers had completely missed. Maya was not trying to be noticed. She never had been. But to Ethan Caldwell, she had always been the easiest person in any room to find. Maya had known Ethan for nearly 11 years, long before Caldwell Tech occupied the top floor of a midtown skyscraper. Back then the company had been nothing more than an idea scribbled across a whiteboard in a cramped apartment barely larger than a storage unit. The rent had been $900 a month. The heat worked only when it felt like cooperating. And the only furniture they owned had been a folding table, 2 chairs, and a coffee machine that rattled like it might explode at any moment. Maya had been there for every late night, every rejected pitch, every morning when Ethan woke up convinced the entire plan was falling apart. She had been the one reminding him to keep going when investors said no. She had been the one turning chaos into structure, scribbling notes, organizing schedules, solving problems before they even reached his desk. Somewhere along the way people started calling her Ethan's assistant, then later his executive coordinator, and eventually his operations director. But Ethan had always introduced her the same way. My best friend. The orchestra in the corner of the ballroom shifted into a softer melody, the music drifting over the quiet murmur of conversation. Maya watched as Ethan spoke with a group of investors near the stage, his posture relaxed but deliberate, the practiced rhythm of a man who knew exactly how to move through powerful rooms. She had seen that transformation happen piece by piece over the years. The hesitant young founder had become a billionaire CEO whose decisions could move markets before breakfast. And still, whenever he spotted her across a room, his expression changed in a way no one else seemed to notice. A small detail, a subtle shift, the quiet recognition of someone who had been there since the beginning. Maya lifted her glass of sparkling water but didn't take a sip. Her reflection in the window looked calm, composed, almost distant. Anyone watching her might have assumed she was simply observing the gala like another executive taking a quiet moment away from the noise. What they would never guess was that every single memory of the last decade was quietly echoing inside her mind. The rooftop night 5 years earlier when Ethan had leaned against the railing of their old office building and said, "You're the only person who never leaves." The road trip to Boston when they drove through a thunderstorm because Ethan refused to miss an investor meeting. The night Caldwell Tech officially crossed its first billion-dollar valuation, and Ethan hugged her so tightly the entire room had laughed. Moments like that had built a kind of closeness neither of them ever tried to name. Because sometimes the most important feelings are the ones people are most careful not to disturb. Across the ballroom, a soft chime echoed through the speakers as someone tapped a microphone. The room gradually quieted, conversations fading into anticipation. Ethan stepped onto the stage, adjusting the cuff of his jacket with a familiar calm. Maya watched him the same way she always had, studying the small details most people overlooked, the way he paused before speaking, the steady confidence in his voice when he finally began. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Ethan said, his tone warm but measured, the voice of a leader addressing the people who believed in his company. "This year has been the most extraordinary chapter Caldwell Tech has ever written." A ripple of applause moved through the audience. Ethan smiled briefly before continuing, thanking investors, partners, and the employees who had helped the company expand across 3 continents in less than 5 years. Maya had heard speeches like this before, dozens of them. She knew exactly how they usually ended. A final note of gratitude. Another round of applause. Maybe a toast. But tonight, Ethan hesitated for just a second longer than usual. And that small pause shifted something in the air. "There is one more announcement I wanted to share tonight," Ethan said. His voice was steady, but Maya felt her chest tighten before she even knew why. A woman stepped onto the stage beside him. Charlotte Whitman. Tall, elegant, the daughter of one of New York's most influential investment families. Her silver dress caught the chandelier light as she smiled at the crowd with effortless confidence. Ethan reached for her hand. Cameras flashed instantly, reporters leaning forward as if sensing something important before it was even spoken aloud. "Charlotte and I are excited to share that we're engaged," Ethan said. For a moment the ballroom exploded with applause, glasses lifting, congratulations echoing from every corner of the room. The orchestra swelled into a celebratory melody as Charlotte leaned closer to Ethan, the diamond ring on her finger reflecting the chandelier light like a tiny constellation. From across the room, Maya watched the scene unfold exactly the way the world expected it to. The powerful CEO. The perfect fiancé. The kind of announcement people would be talking about across business headlines by morning. And Maya Brooks smiled politely, just like everyone else in the room, even though somewhere deep inside her heart a quiet truth finally whispered the one thing she had spent 11 years pretending she didn't already know. The applause inside the ballroom continued for several long seconds after the announcement, echoing beneath the chandeliers like a carefully rehearsed celebration. Glasses clinked together, investors leaned toward one another with approving smiles, and reporters lifted their phones higher to capture the perfect angle of the moment. Ethan Caldwell stood beside Charlotte Whitman on the stage, while flashes of white light burst across the room every few seconds. Charlotte held his hand confidently, her posture flawless, her smile practiced in the way people learn when they grow up surrounded by cameras and attention. The diamond ring on her finger reflected the chandelier light in sharp sparks that bounced across the polished marble floor. Ethan nodded politely to the applause, but for a brief moment his eyes moved away from the crowd and scanned the room again. The movement was small enough that almost no one noticed. But the person he was looking for had already stepped away from the window. Maya Brooks moved quietly through the edge of the ballroom, her navy dress blending easily into the darker shadows near the corridor that led toward the quieter side of the building. No one stopped her. No one asked where she was going. That was one of the strange things about being the person who quietly solved problems behind the scenes. People trusted you to move through rooms without explanation. The music grew louder again as the orchestra shifted into a celebratory rhythm, and the crowd gradually returned to conversation. But the air around Maya felt different now, thinner somehow, like the moment when a door closes in a room and the temperature shifts just enough to notice. She stepped into the corridor where the sound of the gala softened into a distant hum. The hallway lights were warm and steady, reflecting against the smooth walls lined with framed photographs from Caldwell Tech's early years. Maya slowed her steps as she passed one of the photos mounted near the elevator doors. The picture had been taken nearly 8 years earlier. Ethan stood in the center wearing a wrinkled shirt and a grin that looked both exhausted and unstoppable at the same time. Around him were 4 people from the earliest days of the company. Maya was there too, standing slightly to the side, holding a whiteboard, marker in one hand while laughing at something someone had said. The office in the photograph had been tiny. The ceiling tiles were uneven. A folding table sat in the corner with 3 laptops stacked on top of each other because they could not afford enough desks yet. Maya studied the photo for a moment longer than she expected to. She remembered the exact night it had been taken. The company had just landed its first real investor. It had been a small check compared to what Caldwell Tech handled now, but at the time it felt like the beginning of something impossible. Ethan had been so excited he had insisted on ordering pizza for everyone even though the office did not have proper chairs yet. They had eaten sitting on the floor, while whiteboard plans filled every wall around them. Maya remembered the way Ethan had looked at her that night, pointing at the messy diagrams and saying with absolute certainty that the company would grow into something huge one day. She had believed him even when the numbers did not quite make sense yet. The elevator doors opened with a soft sound behind her, and Maya stepped inside, pressing the button for the 28th floor where the executive offices were located. The doors closed quietly, sealing off the distant noise of the celebration downstairs. For a few seconds the elevator moved upward in silence. Maya exhaled slowly and leaned back against the polished metal wall. The reflection staring back at her from the mirrored surface looked calm, almost unreadable. Anyone else might have assumed she was simply tired after a long evening of networking and speeches. But Maya knew the truth was more complicated than that. 11 years was a long time to carry a feeling you never planned to confess. She had never meant for it to happen. In the beginning, Ethan had simply been the ambitious young founder with too many ideas and not enough sleep. Maya had joined his tiny startup because she believed in the concept, and because something about Ethan's determination felt impossible to ignore. Back then, the entire company fit into one apartment that measured barely 600 square feet. The kitchen table had doubled as a conference room. When the internet stopped working, they had driven 2 blocks to a coffee shop and borrowed the wireless signal just to send investor emails. Some nights, they worked until 2 in the morning, surrounded by empty takeout containers and glowing laptop screens. Ethan would run his hands through his hair while pacing across the narrow living room, explaining a product feature with the excitement of someone who could already see the future even when the present looked messy. Maya had been the one organizing those ideas into something real, turning his chaotic whiteboard sketches into schedules, contracts, and deadlines. The elevator doors opened onto the quiet executive floor. Most of the offices were dark because the entire leadership team was attending the gala downstairs. The hallway stretched ahead in soft golden light, the glass walls of the conference rooms reflecting the empty chairs inside. Maya walked slowly toward Ethan's office at the far end. She was not planning to stay long. She only needed a moment somewhere quiet where the noise of the celebration could not reach her. Ethan's office door was slightly open. The room beyond it was exactly the way she had left it earlier that afternoon. A wide desk faced the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan. A few folders were stacked neatly beside the computer screen, and a small notebook lay open near the edge of the desk. Maya stepped inside and moved toward the window. From this height, the city looked calm, almost peaceful, the streets 30 floors below glowing with traffic lights and the soft movement of late-evening commuters. She placed her hands lightly against the cool glass. For years, this office had been the place where Ethan and Maya solved problems together. Late nights reviewing contracts, early mornings preparing investor calls, quiet conversations about strategy while the city woke up beneath them. Somewhere along the way, the room had started to feel less like a workplace and more like a shared chapter of their lives. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. Downstairs, the celebration would still be continuing. Ethan would be shaking hands, thanking investors, smiling for photographs beside Charlotte Whitman. By morning, the engagement would appear across business headlines and social media feeds. It was the kind of story the public loved. The brilliant billionaire CEO and the elegant heiress building a future together. Maya opened her eyes again and looked across the desk. The notebook near the edge caught her attention. Ethan's handwriting filled the page with a series of notes from an earlier meeting. But near the margin, there was a line that had nothing to do with business strategy. It was a single sentence written quickly, almost absent-mindedly. Do not forget to ask Maya what she thinks first. Maya stared at the words for a long moment. A small breath escaped her before she even realized she had been holding it. The truth was that Ethan Caldwell had always trusted her more than anyone else in the room. Even now, on the night he had just promised his future to another woman, that quiet habit had not changed. Maya gently closed the notebook and stepped away from the desk. The city lights outside continued to shimmer across the dark glass, steady and distant. Somewhere deep inside her heart, a quiet realization settled with surprising clarity. Loving someone did not always mean they were meant to be yours. Sometimes it simply meant you were there when they needed someone to believe in them. And sometimes the hardest part of love was learning how to step back with dignity, even when your heart had never truly stepped away. The executive floor remained quiet long after Maya Brooks stepped away from Ethan Caldwell's desk, the soft hum of the building's ventilation system, the only sound filling the hallway outside the glass office walls. From 30 floors above the street, Manhattan looked calm and distant, the headlights of passing cars drifting slowly through the night like tiny moving stars. Maya stood near the window for another moment, letting the silence settle around her, the cool reflection of the glass steady beneath her fingertips. Downstairs the celebration would still be unfolding with bright lights and elegant speeches, but up here the building felt almost like a different world, one where time slowed down enough for memories to rise to the surface. She had not planned to stay long, yet something about the quiet office made it difficult to leave. Perhaps it was because so many of the most important moments of the past decade had happened within these walls. When Caldwell Tech first rented this floor nearly 4 years earlier, the company had already grown far beyond the cramped apartment where it began, but Ethan had insisted that Maya help design the layout of the executive offices. He had said the space needed to feel like a place where ideas could move easily, not just another tower of glass and power suits. Maya remembered the afternoon they walked through the unfinished space wearing construction helmets, stepping carefully over extension cords while sunlight poured through the enormous windows that faced the river. Ethan had stood in the middle of the empty room with his hands on his hips, looking around like someone who had just been handed a map of the future. He had pointed toward the corner where his office would eventually stand, and said that Maya's office should be right across the hall, because he trusted her judgment more than anyone else when decisions mattered. At the time the statement had sounded casual, almost playful, but Maya had understood the truth behind it. Trust had always been the foundation of everything they built together. She turned away from the window now and slowly walked toward the hallway. The carpet softened her footsteps as she passed the dark conference rooms, each one holding the quiet echo of past meetings that stretched late into the night. On the wall beside the largest boardroom hung a framed timeline of Caldwell Tech's rise, a series of photographs marking the milestones that had carried the company from a hopeful startup to one of the most powerful technology firms in the country. Maya paused again in front of the display. The first photo showed the old apartment office, the same image she had seen near the elevator earlier, followed by pictures of product launches, investor conferences, and magazine covers that featured Ethan Caldwell smiling confidently beneath headlines about innovation and leadership. One photograph near the center caught her attention. It showed Ethan standing at a podium during the company's first major press event nearly 6 years earlier. Maya stood just off to the side of the stage in the background, holding a tablet and reviewing notes while the audience listened to Ethan's speech. She remembered that day clearly. Ethan had been nervous before walking onto the stage, even though he tried not to show it. The event had been held in a hotel ballroom only half the size of the one downstairs tonight, but at the time it had felt enormous. Maya had stood beside him behind the curtain moments before the presentation began, while reporters filled the seats and camera crews adjusted their equipment. Ethan had leaned slightly closer and whispered that if the speech went poorly, they might need to consider finding new careers. Maya had smiled and told him that if the speech went poorly, she would simply fix the problems afterward because that was what she always did. Ethan had laughed quietly and said that was exactly why he never worried when she was around. Maya looked at the photograph for a few seconds longer before continuing down the hallway. The memory felt both warm and distant now, like a chapter from a life that had slowly shifted into something more complicated. When the elevator doors opened again a moment later, she stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. The descent felt slower than usual, the gentle motion of the elevator giving her just enough time to gather her thoughts before returning to the celebration below. She reminded herself that the engagement announcement had not truly changed anything about the past 11 years. Ethan was still the same person she had trusted from the beginning, and she was still the person who believed in his vision long before the world noticed his name. Yet something about the evening had quietly rearranged the future in ways she had not expected to confront so suddenly. When the elevator doors opened onto the lobby level, the distant music from the gala returned like a warm wave drifting through the corridors. Laughter echoed faintly from the ballroom as guests continued celebrating the announcement that would soon appear across every major business publication in the country. Maya stepped into the hallway leading back toward the event, adjusting the sleeve of her dress as she walked. Her reflection passed across the polished marble walls, composed and steady, the same calm expression she had learned to carry through every high-pressure moment of her professional life. Just before she reached the ballroom entrance, she paused beside one of the tall columns that framed the doorway. From this angle, she could see the stage again. Charlotte Whitman stood surrounded by several reporters, while a group of investors congratulated Ethan nearby. The cameras continued flashing, capturing the perfect image of a powerful partnership forming between two influential families. Ethan listened politely as someone spoke to him, nodding occasionally, but Maya noticed the subtle way his attention drifted toward the edges of the room between conversations. It was a small habit she had recognized many times before, the instinctive glance he made whenever he wanted to confirm that the person he trusted most was still nearby. Maya understood that look better than anyone. She had seen it during investor meetings, product launches, and even casual dinners when Ethan wanted a silent confirmation that everything was moving in the right direction. For years, she had always been there when he searched the room. Tonight was the first time she wondered what would happen if one day he looked up and did not find her standing in the familiar place she had always occupied. The thought did not bring anger or bitterness. Instead, it carried a quiet clarity that felt almost peaceful. Loving someone did not mean they owed you a future. Sometimes it simply meant that the years you shared had shaped both of your lives in ways the world might never fully understand. Maya straightened slightly and stepped away from the column. The ballroom lights spilled across the floor as she walked back into the celebration, her posture calm, her expression warm enough to greet the colleagues who turned to acknowledge her return. In the center of the room, Ethan Caldwell continued shaking hands with investors and reporters, unaware that somewhere behind the quiet strength in Maya Brooks's smile a decision had already begun to take shape, one that would quietly change both of their lives in ways neither of them yet understood. The celebration inside the ballroom continued to glow with polished elegance long after Maya Brooks stepped fully back into the crowd, the music rising gently above the quiet roar of conversation and camera flashes. The chandeliers scattered soft light across the marble floor, reflecting off champagne glasses and designer watches, while waiters moved carefully between clusters of guests. Investors laughed beside journalists, and executives from across the technology industry gathered near the stage where Ethan Caldwell and Charlotte Whitman continued greeting well-wishers. For most people in the room, the evening felt like the perfect symbol of success, the kind of moment that confirmed a powerful future was already taking shape. But Maya understood something about moments like this that many people never noticed. Sometimes the most important changes in life happened quietly in the corners of a crowded room. She moved calmly through the gathering, exchanging polite greetings with colleagues who had worked alongside her for years. Several executives congratulated her on the company's growth, assuming she was simply another member of the leadership team celebrating an important milestone. Maya returned their smiles easily. She had spent more than a decade learning how to navigate rooms filled with power without ever drawing attention to herself. That quiet confidence was part of the reason Ethan had trusted her from the beginning. From across the ballroom, Ethan continued speaking with a group of investors who had traveled from San Francisco for the gala. Charlotte stood nearby answering questions from reporters, her voice smooth and practiced as she explained how excited she was about the future they planned to build together. The reporters listened carefully, writing notes and capturing photographs that would appear online before morning. Ethan responded to a question from one of the investors, but as he finished speaking his eyes drifted again toward the edges of the crowd. The instinct was automatic. For years Maya had always been somewhere nearby, whenever he glanced up from a conversation. She was the quiet center that kept everything balanced. Tonight, he searched the room for only a second before his attention was pulled back into another discussion about international expansion plans. Maya noticed the small movement from across the room. She had always been good at reading Ethan's habits even when the rest of the world saw only the polished image of a billionaire chief executive officer. That was the difference between knowing someone in headlines and knowing the real person who stayed awake at 2 in the morning reviewing product designs or pacing across the office floor while thinking through a difficult decision. Maya turned slightly and stepped toward the refreshment table where a row of sparkling water glasses rested beside a tall arrangement of winter flowers. The scent of pine and white roses drifted softly through the air. She picked up a glass and paused for a moment, watching the light ripple across the surface of the water. For years she had imagined this evening might arrive in some form. Ethan was a public figure now, the kind of man whose life naturally attracted attention from powerful families and influential circles. A marriage between Ethan Caldwell and Charlotte Whitman would not only unite two respected names in the business world, but would also strengthen the company's position in ways analysts would admire. Maya understood the strategy behind it as clearly as anyone else. She had helped Ethan think through enough complex decisions to recognize when something made perfect sense on paper. Yet there were moments when life did not follow the neat logic of business plans. Maya took a small sip of water and set the glass down again. She remembered a different evening nearly 7 years earlier when Caldwell Tech had secured its first major partnership with a national technology distributor. The deal had been the turning point that allowed the company to expand beyond its original office. That night, Ethan and Maya had celebrated quietly in the small kitchen of their old workspace. The building had been nearly empty except for a few late-night programmers finishing code updates. Ethan had leaned against the counter holding a paper cup of coffee while reviewing the contract one last time. Maya had teased him for checking the details again even though the agreement had already been signed. Ethan had laughed and said he trusted her judgment more than his own when it came to making sure everything was right. Then he had grown serious for a moment and told her that if the company ever became something truly significant, he hoped they would always remember where it began. Maya had promised him that they would. The memory passed through her mind like a quiet photograph drifting across the surface of the present moment. Across the ballroom, the orchestra shifted into another soft melody as the evening continued unfolding around them. Several members of the board of directors approached Ethan and Charlotte to offer congratulations. Ethan listened respectfully while Charlotte spoke with graceful confidence beside him, her voice carrying the calm assurance of someone raised in influential circles. Maya watched the scene for only a moment before turning away again. The decision that had begun forming inside her heart earlier in the evening was becoming clearer now. Sometimes the strongest form of loyalty was knowing when to step aside so that someone you cared about could follow the path they believed was right. She walked toward the far side of the ballroom, where the tall windows overlooked the river. The city lights reflected across the dark water, stretching for miles beneath the winter sky. New York never truly slept, and from this height the movement of the streets below looked almost peaceful. Maya rested one hand lightly against the cool glass. 11 years was long enough to build an entire life around a friendship. Every challenge the company had faced, every decision that shaped its future, had carried the quiet rhythm of their partnership. Yet the world was changing now in ways neither of them had expected when they first started working together. The soft sound of footsteps approached behind her. Maya turned slightly as Ethan's voice reached her before she even saw him. "I wondered where you disappeared to for a minute." His tone carried the same familiar warmth he had always used with her, the easy trust that came from years of shared victories and sleepless nights solving impossible problems. Maya looked at him and smiled gently. "I was just getting some air," she replied. Ethan stepped beside her near the window, adjusting the sleeve of his jacket while glancing out at the city lights below. For a brief moment, the noise of the ballroom faded behind them, leaving only the quiet reflection of Manhattan stretching into the distance. It was the same view they had shared countless times during late-night strategy sessions in the office upstairs. Ethan rested his hands lightly against the railing beneath the window and exhaled slowly. "Nights like this still feel unreal sometimes," he said with a small laugh. Maya nodded softly. "You worked hard enough for it to become real." Ethan turned his head slightly to look at her. "You worked just as hard as I did. You know that." Maya met his gaze calmly. The sincerity in his voice had always been one of the things she respected most about him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt familiar, comfortable in the way it had always been. But beneath that comfort, something unspoken hovered quietly in the space between two people who had built a life together without ever defining exactly what that life meant. Ethan finally glanced back toward the crowd where Charlotte stood speaking with several reporters. I should probably get back before the board starts wondering where I went, he said. Maya nodded again, her expression steady and warm. They will survive 30 seconds without you. Ethan smiled slightly at that, the same easy smile that had carried them through years of challenges. Before he stepped away, he looked at her once more with a thoughtful expression that lingered for just a second longer than expected. You know, I always trust your instincts more than anyone else, he said quietly. If something ever feels off, you tell me. Maya held his gaze with calm clarity. I always have, she replied gently. Ethan nodded and turned back toward the celebration. As he walked away, Maya remained beside the window, watching the reflection of the city lights ripple across the glass. Somewhere inside her heart, she understood that the promise she had just made carried a meaning far deeper than Ethan realized. Because sometimes the greatest instinct a person could follow was the quiet understanding of when it was finally time to let go. The music in the ballroom continued long after Ethan Caldwell walked back toward the center of the celebration, but the moment he stepped away from the tall window, something inside him felt slightly different, though he could not yet explain why. The evening had unfolded exactly the way it was supposed to. The investors were satisfied, the reporters were already preparing headlines, and Charlotte Whitman was handling the attention with polished confidence beside the stage. Everything about the engagement made sense to the outside world. Yet as Ethan returned to the cluster of executives waiting to congratulate him, a small part of his mind remained fixed on the quiet moment he had just shared with Maya Brooks near the window. It was a habit he had carried for years without realizing it. Whenever the room became too loud or the decisions too complicated, Maya was usually somewhere nearby, offering the calm perspective he trusted more than anyone else. The board members shook his hand firmly, offering warm congratulations while discussing how the partnership between the Caldwell and Whitman families could strengthen future investments. Ethan responded with the steady confidence expected from a chief executive officer, but his attention drifted occasionally toward the far side of the ballroom where Maya had been standing earlier. She was no longer by the window. The space near the glass was empty except for the reflection of city lights stretching across the river. Charlotte stepped closer to him, her silver dress catching the chandelier light as she smiled at another group of reporters approaching from the opposite side of the room. Ethan leaned slightly toward her while answering a question about Caldwell Tech's upcoming expansion into the European market. Charlotte spoke smoothly beside him, her voice calm and practiced. The kind of composure that came naturally to someone who had grown up attending events like this since childhood. When the reporters finally stepped away, Charlotte turned toward Ethan with a satisfied expression. This is going exactly the way my father predicted, she said lightly. The press loves the story already. Ethan nodded politely. Your father understands the media better than most people in this room. Charlotte laughed softly and glanced toward the center of the ballroom, where another group of guests had gathered near the orchestra. We should probably thank a few more investors before the night ends. There are at least 3 venture partners waiting to speak with you. Ethan followed her gaze and nodded again, but the quiet distraction in the back of his mind had not disappeared. He had known Maya long enough to recognize when something about her behavior shifted even slightly. During the brief conversation near the window, her voice had sounded calm, yet there had been a quiet finality beneath her words that he could not fully place. It was subtle enough that no one else would have noticed. But Ethan Caldwell had built an entire company on noticing the smallest details. They spent another 15 minutes greeting guests while the orchestra continued playing soft music beneath the chandeliers. The evening slowly began to wind down as some of the older investors prepared to leave and the reporters finished collecting final quotes for their articles. Eventually, Ethan glanced across the room again and spotted Maya near the exit corridor speaking briefly with the company's chief financial officer. She smiled politely as they finished their conversation, then turned toward the hallway leading out of the ballroom. Ethan excused himself from the group around him and crossed the floor just as Maya stepped into the corridor. The music faded slightly behind him as he followed her into the quieter space beyond the ballroom doors. The hallway lighting was softer here, the polished marble walls reflecting a gentle glow that contrasted with the bright energy of the celebration behind them. Maya was already walking toward the lobby elevators when she heard his footsteps and turned around. I was wondering if you might leave without saying goodbye tonight, Ethan said with a small smile. Maya returned the smile calmly. I did not want to interrupt your engagement celebration. That seems like an important night for you. Ethan, stopped a few feet away from her, and studied her expression for a moment. You never interrupt anything. You know that. If anything, you usually make sure everything runs smoothly while the rest of us take credit for it. Maya gave a quiet laugh. Someone has to keep the chaos organized. Ethan slipped his hands into the pockets of his jacket and leaned slightly against the wall beside the elevator. You are heading out already. The night is still young. Maya glanced toward the elevator panel where the lights indicated the car was moving down from a higher floor. I have an early morning tomorrow. There are still several logistics reports I need to review before the board meeting next week. Ethan frowned slightly. That can wait until morning. Maya shook her head gently. Some things are easier to think through when the building is quiet. Ethan studied her again, the thoughtful expression returning to his face. You have been quiet tonight. Maya raised an eyebrow lightly. That might be the first time anyone has said that about me in 11 years. Ethan smiled, but the curiosity remained in his eyes. I mean quieter than usual. Maya paused before answering, choosing her words carefully the way she always did when something important needed to be said, without creating unnecessary tension. Tonight was a big step for you, Ethan. I was just giving you space to enjoy it. Ethan nodded slowly, accepting the explanation even though something about it still felt incomplete. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime behind Maya. She turned slightly and stepped inside, pressing the button for the lobby. Ethan remained standing in the hallway watching her for a second longer than necessary. You will be at the office tomorrow, right? Maya hesitated briefly before answering. Yes. There are still a few things I want to organize before the next quarter begins. Ethan nodded. Good. I wanted to talk with you about some of the strategic plans Charlotte's family mentioned tonight. I would rather review them with you before making any decisions. Maya met his gaze with the same calm steadiness she had always shown him. Of course. That is what I am here for. The elevator doors began sliding closed, but before they sealed completely, Ethan spoke again. Maya. She looked up at him. Thank you for tonight. For everything you have done to help build all of this. Maya's smile was soft but sincere. You do not need to thank me. I believed in the vision just as much as you did. The doors closed quietly between them. As the elevator began descending toward the lobby, Maya exhaled slowly and leaned back against the mirrored wall, watching the reflection of the hallway lights fade upward through the glass. Meanwhile, Ethan remained standing in the corridor outside the ballroom for several seconds longer than he expected. The music from the gala drifted faintly through the doorway behind him, but his thoughts were no longer on the celebration. For the first time that evening, he felt the subtle sense that something important had shifted, like the quiet moment before a storm when the air changes just enough for someone paying attention to notice. And Ethan Caldwell had always been very good at noticing the details that everyone else missed. The elevator carried Maya Brooks down through the quiet tower of Caldwell Tech, while the celebration upstairs slowly faded into distant echoes of music and laughter. The mirrored walls reflected her calm expression as the numbers above the door changed one floor at a time. From 30 floors above the city, the night skyline had looked peaceful, but here inside the elevator the silence felt heavier, like the quiet moment after a chapter of life had closed. When the doors finally opened into the main lobby, the atmosphere felt entirely different from the energy of the gala upstairs. The building's wide marble entrance hall was nearly empty, illuminated by soft golden lights and the gentle hum of late-night traffic drifting through the revolving glass doors. A security guard near the reception desk nodded politely as Maya crossed the lobby. He had seen her arrive and leave at every hour imaginable during the past decade. Maya stepped outside into the crisp New York air where the winter breeze carried the distant sounds of the city. Taxis moved steadily along the avenue, their headlights stretching across the pavement, while pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks wrapped in coats and scarves. The temperature hovered just above 30 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that Maya slipped her hands into the pockets of her coat while waiting near the curb. A car service driver pulled forward moments later and opened the rear door for her. As the vehicle merged into traffic, Maya leaned back against the seat and watched the glowing skyline disappear behind them. For years, the Caldwell Tech Tower had been the center of her daily life. Nearly every morning began before sunrise with coffee and strategy meetings, and many nights ended long after midnight, while reviewing financial reports or solving unexpected problems. The rhythm had become so familiar that she rarely thought about what life might look like outside of it. Yet tonight something inside her mind kept returning to the quiet clarity she felt near the ballroom window. Loving someone for 11 years without speaking the truth was not a mistake she regretted. Those years had built something real between them, something stronger than most partnerships in business or friendship. But she also understood that love sometimes asked for a different kind of courage. The courage to accept when someone you care about is building a future that does not include you. The car traveled across the East River Bridge, the dark water below reflecting thousands of city lights. Maya rested her head lightly against the window as the driver navigated the late-night traffic. Her apartment was on the Upper West Side, a quiet building several miles from the office. The location had always been convenient for the long hours she spent working, yet tonight the distance felt symbolic in a way she had never noticed before. When the car finally stopped in front of her building nearly 20 minutes later, Maya stepped out onto the sidewalk and thanked the driver. The doorman greeted her with a warm smile before opening the glass door. "Good evening, Miss Brooks," he said kindly. "Late night again?" Maya smiled back. "Something like that." The lobby of the building was quiet and comfortable, decorated with soft lighting and warm wood panels that created a calm contrast to the sharp energy of the corporate world she spent most of her days navigating. She rode the elevator up to the 12th floor and walked down the hallway to her apartment. Inside, the space felt peaceful and organized, a reflection of the way Maya approached nearly everything in her life. Bookshelves lined one wall of the living room, filled with business strategy guides, biographies, and several framed photographs from earlier years of Caldwell Tech. Maya set her coat over the back of a chair and moved toward the large window facing the city. From here, the skyline still looked close enough to touch, the tall buildings glowing against the dark sky like quiet monuments to ambition. She poured herself a glass of water and stood beside the window for several minutes thinking about the next morning. The board meeting Ethan mentioned earlier would involve reviewing several potential partnerships connected to Charlotte Whitman's family network. Maya had already seen some of the preliminary proposals weeks ago, but now those discussions carried a different weight. If Ethan moved forward with those agreements, the structure of Caldwell Tech could change significantly over the next year. For a long time, Maya had assumed she would help guide those decisions the same way she always had. Yet tonight another possibility had quietly begun forming in her mind. She walked across the room and opened her laptop on the dining table. The screen illuminated the apartment with a soft blue glow as she reviewed a series of documents she had prepared earlier in the week. They were not financial reports or product development outlines like the ones she usually worked on. Instead, they contained research about several nonprofit technology education programs operating in underserved communities across the country. Maya had started studying those organizations months ago during rare moments when she allowed herself to think about life beyond the corporate world. She believed strongly that access to technology education could change the future for thousands of young people who might never otherwise have the opportunity to explore careers in innovation. The idea had grown quietly in the background of her mind, while she continued focusing on Caldwell Tech's success. Tonight, for the first time, the possibility felt real enough to consider seriously. Maya scrolled through the files slowly, reviewing the notes she had collected about program funding, training initiatives, and scholarship opportunities. Somewhere between the strategy meetings and product launches of the past decade, she had discovered that her passion for building systems extended far beyond corporate growth. She wanted to help create opportunities for people who rarely receive the kind of mentorship she had been fortunate enough to experience. The thought did not feel like running away from anything. Instead, it felt like stepping toward a future she had quietly imagined for years but never allowed herself to pursue. Meanwhile, several miles away, Ethan Caldwell finally returned to his penthouse apartment after the last guests left the gala. The celebration had lasted longer than expected as reporters continued asking questions and investors insisted on offering their congratulations one more time. By the time Ethan stepped into the quiet space overlooking Central Park, the city lights had already begun fading into the early hours of the morning. He loosened his tie and set his phone on the kitchen counter, pouring a glass of water while replaying the events of the evening in his mind. Charlotte had left earlier to meet her parents for a late dinner, leaving Ethan alone with the silence of the apartment. Normally, a successful event like the gala would leave him energized, already planning the next steps for the company. Tonight, however, His thoughts kept circling back to the same detail he could not quite ignore. Maya Brooks had always been present during the most important moments of Caldwell Tech's history. Yet when he searched the ballroom earlier that evening, she had not been standing where she usually stood. The realization settled quietly in the back of his mind as he looked out across the dark park below his windows. For years he had trusted Maya's instincts without question. Now, for the first time, he wondered whether those instincts might be guiding her toward a path he had not yet considered. Morning sunlight slowly spread across the Upper West Side as Maya Brooks stood in her kitchen holding a mug of coffee, the quiet rhythm of the city waking up beyond her apartment window. The skyline looked softer in the early hours, the tall buildings washed in pale gold as the sun climbed above the river. Traffic had already begun filling the streets below, taxis weaving between delivery trucks while pedestrians hurried toward subway entrances with scarves pulled tight against the cold. Maya had been awake for nearly an hour, reviewing the documents she opened the night before while the city slept. Her laptop still rested on the dining table, the screen filled with detailed notes about technology education programs and nonprofit initiatives across the country. She had highlighted sections describing how access to basic coding skills could transform opportunities for young students in communities that rarely saw the inside of corporate offices like Caldwell Tech. The idea had been quietly building in her mind for months, growing stronger each time she visited schools during the company's occasional community outreach events. She knew firsthand how a single opportunity could change the direction of a life. The coffee in her hands had already cooled slightly as she reread a paragraph about mentorship programs connecting experienced technology professionals with high school students who dreamed of careers in innovation. Maya imagined what it would look like to build something that did not revolve around profit margins or quarterly investor expectations. A system designed entirely to open doors for people who had never believed those doors were meant for them. The thought felt both exciting and strangely peaceful. For the first time in years, she could clearly picture a future that did not begin and end inside the glass walls of Caldwell Tech's headquarters. Across the city, Ethan Caldwell stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, the early morning sunlight reflecting across the frozen edges of the lake below. He had slept only a few hours after returning home from the gala. The excitement of the evening had slowly faded into a restless series of thoughts that refused to settle. Normally after a major event, Ethan would already be reviewing the next phase of strategy for the company, his mind racing ahead toward new markets and partnerships. But this morning something else kept interrupting his focus. Maya Brooks had always been the one person he never needed to second-guess. Her judgment had guided countless decisions during the past 11 years, from the earliest product launch to the complex negotiations that eventually made Caldwell Tech one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country. The strange part was that he had never truly considered what the company might look like if Maya were not there to steady every unpredictable moment. Ethan poured a cup of coffee and leaned against the kitchen counter while the city slowly came alive outside his windows. The engagement announcement had been planned carefully with Charlotte and her family advisors, and on paper it made perfect sense. Their combined influence would strengthen investor confidence and open new connections across international markets. Charlotte was intelligent, poised, and respected in business circles. Everything about the arrangement fit the expectations of the world he now lived in. Yet the quiet image of Maya, standing beside the ballroom window the night before, continued returning to his mind. There had been something in her voice that felt final in a way he could not fully explain. He checked his watch and realized it was already 8:30 in the morning. Maya would almost certainly be at the office by now. For years she had been the first person to arrive and the last one to leave. Ethan finished his coffee, grabbed his coat, and headed downstairs toward the private parking garage. Less than 20 minutes later his car pulled into the circular entrance of Caldwell Tech's headquarters. The glass tower reflected the morning sky as employees streamed through the front doors carrying laptops and paper cups of coffee. Inside the lobby, the familiar energy of a new workday had already begun. Ethan walked quickly across the marble floor toward the elevator bank, nodding briefly to several employees who greeted him on their way toward meetings. The elevator climbed smoothly toward the executive floors while Ethan reviewed the day's schedule on his phone. The board meeting Charlotte mentioned would begin shortly before noon. leaving a few hours to prepare the strategic proposals her family had suggested. Normally, he would review those details with Maya first before presenting anything to the board. That routine had become almost automatic after more than a decade of working side by side. When the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, Ethan stepped out expecting to see the familiar glow of Maya's office light across the hallway from his own. Instead, the corridor was quiet. Her door was closed. Ethan frowned slightly and walked toward the reception desk outside the executive offices where Daniel, the senior administrative coordinator, was organizing a stack of documents. "Morning, Daniel," Ethan said casually. "Has Maya come in yet?" Daniel looked up with mild surprise. "Actually, she was here earlier this morning. Around 7, I think." Ethan paused. Daniel nodded. "She left about half an hour ago. Said she had a meeting across town, but did not give many details." Ethan stood still for a moment longer than expected. That was unusual. Maya rarely scheduled external meetings without mentioning them during the previous day's planning sessions. "Did she say when she would be back?" Ethan asked. Daniel shook his head. "Just said she would update the calendar later." Ethan nodded slowly and walked toward his office without another word. Inside the room, the sunlight stretched across his desk, illuminating the stack of documents Maya had prepared for the upcoming board meeting. Everything looked exactly the way it always did when she organized a major presentation. Every report labeled clearly, every chart aligned perfectly with the next stage of discussion. Ethan picked up one of the folders and opened it, scanning the notes Maya had left beside the financial projections. Her handwriting filled the margins with careful observations about potential risks and opportunities connected to the Whitman partnership. The analysis was as sharp and thoughtful as always. Yet for the first time since Caldwell Tech had grown into a global company, Ethan found himself wondering about something far more personal than business strategy. Maya Brooks had never walked away from a decision without a clear reason, and the quiet feeling he had noticed the night before was now growing stronger, like the beginning of a question he had not yet learned how to ask. Late morning sunlight poured across the glass walls of Caldwell Tech's executive floor, while Ethan Caldwell remained standing beside his desk, the folder of board meeting reports still open in his hands. The quiet hallway outside his office carried the faint rhythm of employees moving between meetings, but inside the room the silence felt heavier than usual. Maya Brooks had always been the steady presence behind every major decision the company made. Her office light was normally the first one glowing when the building opened each morning, and she rarely left before the evening skyline filled the windows. Yet today the chair across the hallway from his office remained empty. Ethan set the folder down and walked slowly toward the large window overlooking Midtown Manhattan. From this height, the city looked like a living machine, traffic moving through the streets with precise rhythm, while thousands of workers filled office towers across the skyline. For years, Ethan had viewed the city through the lens of strategy and opportunity. Every new building represented a potential client. Every conversation a possible partnership that could expand Caldwell Tech's reach across the global market. But this morning his thoughts kept circling back to something far less predictable than business growth. Maya Brooks had left the office early without saying exactly where she was going. The details should not have mattered so much. Yet Ethan could not shake the feeling that something important was shifting beneath the surface of a routine workday. He glanced down at his phone and considered calling her directly. For a moment he almost did. Then he stopped himself. Maya had always respected clear boundaries between work and personal decisions, and Ethan had built their professional partnership on mutual trust rather than constant oversight. If she said she would update the calendar later, she would. Still, the quiet curiosity remained. Across town, Maya Brooks stepped out of a subway station several miles from Caldwell Tech's headquarters. The neighborhood looked different from the polished corporate district where she spent most of her days. Small storefronts lined the street, and murals painted across brick walls added bright color to the sidewalks. A public middle school stood near the corner, its playground filled with students enjoying the last minutes of their lunch break. Maya paused briefly outside the school gate, watching a group of teenagers laughing as they practiced basketball shots beneath a metal hoop attached to the back wall of the gymnasium. The ball echoed against the pavement with steady rhythm, while a teacher stood nearby, offering quiet encouragement. Maya felt a familiar sense of recognition while watching the scene. She remembered standing in a similar playground many years earlier, dreaming about possibilities that seemed distant at the time. Education had been the bridge that carried her toward opportunities she once believed belonged only to other people. A community center stood across the street from the school, its modest brick building surrounded by colorful banners advertising after-school technology programs. Maya walked toward the entrance where a small sign displayed the words Innovation Pathways Learning Center. Inside, the building buzzed with quiet activity. A group of students sat around several computer tables working through coding exercises while a volunteer instructor explained the basics of software design. The room was simple but organized, with whiteboards covered in diagrams and motivational quotes about creativity and problem-solving. A woman in her mid-40s approached Maya with a welcoming smile. "You must be Maya Brooks," she said warmly. "I am Elena Rodriguez. We spoke on the phone last week." Maya returned the smile and shook her hand. "Thank you for meeting with me. I wanted to see the program in person before making any decisions." Elena nodded enthusiastically. "Of course. We are always happy when someone from the technology industry takes interest in what we are doing here." She gestured toward the classroom where the students continued working quietly at their computers. Most of these kids had never written a single line of code before joining the program. Now some of them are already designing their own applications. Maya watched the students for a moment, noticing the focused expressions on their faces as they solved small programming challenges. The scene reminded her of the early days of Caldwell Tech when Ethan and a handful of determined engineers worked through endless nights trying to transform ambitious ideas into functioning technology. That same spark of curiosity filled the room now, but here the opportunity to explore it depended entirely on volunteers and limited community funding. Elena continued explaining the program's mission while guiding Maya through the building. They passed a small robotics lab where a group of younger students tested miniature machines they had assembled from colorful plastic components. The excitement in their voices echoed through the hallway as one of the robots successfully followed a line of tape across the floor. Maya listened carefully as Elena described the challenges the center faced each year. Funding was unpredictable, and access to updated equipment remained limited compared to well-funded schools in wealthier neighborhoods. Yet the dedication of the volunteers kept the program alive because they believed the students deserved a chance to discover their potential. Maya nodded thoughtfully while taking notes on a small tablet she carried with her. The more she observed the center, the more certain she felt about the idea that had been growing quietly in her mind for months. Building a technology education initiative like this on a larger scale could create opportunities for thousands of students who rarely imagined themselves working in innovation or engineering. Meanwhile, back at Caldwell Tech's headquarters, Ethan Caldwell sat at the conference table reviewing the strategic partnership proposals prepared for the upcoming board meeting. Charlotte Whitman arrived shortly after 11. Stepping into the room with her usual composed confidence. She greeted Ethan with a polite smile before taking a seat across from him. "I hope you had time to look over the investment projections my father's team sent this morning," she said. Ethan nodded and slid a folder toward her. "I have reviewed the initial numbers. There are some interesting possibilities here." Charlotte leaned forward slightly, studying his expression. "You sound thoughtful. Usually when you find something interesting you look more excited than that." Ethan smiled faintly, but did not immediately respond. His attention drifted briefly toward the empty chair that Maya usually occupied during these discussions. Charlotte noticed the glance and followed his gaze. "Is Maya joining us today?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "She had an early meeting across town. She will review everything later." Charlotte tapped her pen lightly against the folder while considering his answer. "I have heard a great deal about her," she said after a moment. "People in the company speak about her like she is the quiet engine behind everything you built." Ethan's expression softened slightly. "That is not far from the truth." Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. "Then I suppose we should make sure the future plans we create here respect the foundation she helped build." Ethan looked back down at the documents in front of him, but his thoughts were no longer entirely focused on numbers or contracts. Somewhere across the city, Maya Brooks was exploring a path he had not yet imagined, and the quiet feeling that something important was changing continued growing stronger with every passing hour. The afternoon sun drifted slowly across the tall glass windows of Caldwell Tech's executive conference room while the board meeting continued unfolding around the long polished table. Ethan Caldwell sat at the head of the room listening as one of the senior financial advisors explained projections connected to the Whitman family investment network. Charts glowed across the large presentation screen, while several board members reviewed printed reports Maya Brooks had prepared earlier that morning. Her careful analysis filled every page with detailed observations about potential risks and long-term opportunities. Even though Maya herself was not present in the room, her influence shaped nearly every part of the discussion. One of the directors adjusted his glasses and leaned forward while studying the documents. Whoever organized these projections clearly anticipated several of the regulatory complications we might face overseas, he said thoughtfully. Ethan nodded slightly. Maya prepared the analysis before the meeting. She wanted to make sure we considered every possible outcome before finalizing any partnership decisions. Another board member tapped a pen lightly against the table. She has a reputation for thinking 2 steps ahead of everyone else in this building. Charlotte Whitman sat beside Ethan reviewing the same reports with focused attention. She had spent the morning discussing investment opportunities with her father's advisory team, yet even she seemed quietly impressed by the depth of preparation Maya had provided. The meeting continued for nearly another hour while the board evaluated each proposal. By the time the final discussion ended, the early afternoon sunlight had shifted across the conference table. Ethan closed the folder in front of him and stood while the other executives gathered their documents. Thank you, everyone. We will review the final numbers before making any public announcements about the partnership structure. Several board members shook his hand before leaving the room, their voices fading into the hallway outside. Charlotte remained seated for a moment longer while reviewing one last page of the analysis Maya had written. She looked up at Ethan with a thoughtful expression. I understand now why everyone speaks so highly of her, she said quietly. These reports are thorough in a way most executives rarely achieve. Ethan allowed himself a small smile. She has always believed that preparation is the difference between luck and strategy. Charlotte closed the folder and stood. My father will appreciate this level of detail. It means the company is not rushing into decisions simply because of our engagement. Ethan nodded, but his attention drifted again toward the empty chair that Maya normally occupied during meetings like this. He had already asked Daniel earlier in the day if Maya had returned to the building. The answer was still no. Charlotte noticed the direction of his gaze and spoke carefully. You are wondering where she is, she said gently. Ethan exhaled quietly before answering. She mentioned a meeting across town this morning, but did not give many details. That is unusual for her. Charlotte studied him for a moment before speaking again. Perhaps she needed a day away from the office. After last night, the company must feel very different to her as well. Ethan looked back at Charlotte. What do you mean by that? Charlotte walked slowly toward the window overlooking the city. I have spent enough time around powerful organizations to recognize when someone important stands quietly behind the scenes. People like Maya often build the foundation that allows others to stand in the spotlight. When the structure of leadership changes, it can make them question where they fit in the future. Ethan remained silent while considering her words. Charlotte turned back toward him with a calm expression. I am not criticizing the engagement. I agreed to it for many reasons that make sense for both of our families. But even strategic decisions affect people in ways business plans do not always predict. Ethan nodded slowly. That is true. Charlotte picked up her coat and walked toward the door. For what it is worth, I hope you do speak with her soon. A partnership like the one you built with Maya does not happen often. Ethan watched her leave the room before turning back toward the window. From this height, the city looked endless, the movement of traffic flowing through the streets like quiet rivers of light. For more than a decade, his professional life had followed a steady rhythm of decisions and growth, every step carefully planned with Maya standing beside him as the person who understood his instincts better than anyone else. Now that rhythm felt slightly unbalanced, like a machine missing one essential part. Meanwhile, several miles away, Maya Brooks stood inside the Innovation Pathways Learning Center, watching a group of students gather around a small robotics table. The instructor encouraged them to adjust the sensors on their prototype machine, while explaining how simple programming commands could guide the robot through a maze drawn across the floor. One of the younger students looked up at Maya with curiosity. Do you work with computers too? He asked shyly. Maya smiled warmly. Yes, I do. I help build technology that connects people around the world. The boy's eyes widened with excitement. That sounds amazing. I want to build something like that one day. Maya knelt beside the table so she could look directly at him. You can if you keep learning and asking questions. Every great invention begins with curiosity. Elena Rodriguez approached them a moment later holding several printed program outlines. I wanted to show you some of the expansion plans we have dreamed about for years, but never had the funding to attempt, she explained while handing the papers to Maya. The documents described additional classrooms, upgraded computer equipment, and mentorship partnerships that could reach students in several neighboring districts. Maya read through the pages carefully while listening to Elena describe the possibilities. The vision reminded her of the earliest days of Caldwell Tech, when Ethan had spoken passionately about technology transforming the world for the better. Except here the impact would be direct and immediate, changing the lives of students who might otherwise never see a path into innovation. Maya looked around the room again, at the young programmers experimenting with their projects. In that moment she understood something clearly. The skills she had developed during 11 years of building a successful technology company could help create opportunities far beyond corporate profit margins. Elena watched her expression with quiet hope. What do you think? Maya folded the papers gently and met her gaze. I think the work you are doing here deserves a much larger platform than this building can provide. Elena's eyes brightened. You mean you might want to help us grow it? Maya nodded slowly. I believe I can help build a structure that brings resources, mentors, and technology access to many more students than this center alone can reach. Elena smiled with excitement while the students continued working in the background. For the first time that day, Maya felt a sense of direction that matched the quiet decision forming in her heart since the night before. Somewhere across the city, Ethan Caldwell was beginning to realize that the person who had helped build his empire might soon be following a path that neither of them had ever planned. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the streets outside the Innovation Pathways Learning Center, while Maya Brooks stood beside Elena Rodriguez reviewing the expansion plans one more time. The classroom behind them had grown quieter as several students packed their backpacks and prepared to head home, their voices echoing with excitement about the projects they had worked on that day. A few younger students lingered near the robotics table, still experimenting with the small machine that followed a strip of black tape across the floor. Maya watched them for a moment, noticing the focus in their eyes and the way they leaned toward the computer screen when something finally worked the way they expected. She had seen that same look of discovery many times during the early years of Caldwell Tech, when the engineers solved difficult programming problems after hours of trial and error. Innovation always began with curiosity and persistence, whether inside a billion-dollar company or a modest classroom like this one. Elena folded her arms lightly while studying Maya's thoughtful expression. When we first started this program 5 years ago, we had only 6 students and 2 outdated laptops donated by a local office, she explained. Most people assumed it would never grow beyond a small volunteer project. But every year more, students arrive asking if they can learn how technology works. Maya nodded slowly. Curiosity has a way of expanding faster than resources. That is why programs like this matter so much. Elena smiled with quiet pride. I have always believed that if someone simply gives these students access to the right tools and guidance, they can achieve far more than anyone expects. Maya looked down again at the printed outlines describing the center's expansion plans. Several pages detailed potential partnerships with community colleges, mentorship networks connecting industry professionals with young students, and scholarship programs designed to help graduates pursue careers in software engineering or data science. The vision was ambitious but practical, the same combination that had once drawn her toward Ethan Caldwell's earliest ideas about Caldwell Tech. Maya closed the folder gently and met Elena's gaze. If this program were expanded across several cities, how many students do you believe it could reach in the next 5 years? She asked. Elena considered the question carefully. With proper funding, equipment, and trained mentors, we could easily support thousands of students every year. The real challenge has always been building a structure strong enough to grow without losing the personal attention each student deserves. Maya nodded thoughtfully. That challenge sounds very familiar. Elena tilted her head slightly. You have experience solving problems like that, do you not? Maya allowed herself a small smile. For the past 11 years, I have helped build a technology company that expanded from one small apartment office to a global organization with thousands of employees. Scaling systems while protecting the original vision is something I understand well. Elena's eyes widened slightly. Are you saying you might consider helping us develop something larger than this single center? Maya paused before answering. The decision forming in her mind had been growing clearer since the night of the gala, but speaking it aloud still felt like crossing an invisible line between two different futures. I believe there is an opportunity here to create a national program that connects technology professionals with underserved schools, she said slowly. A network of learning centers, mentorship programs, and scholarships designed to help students enter the innovation economy. Elena looked around the classroom with excitement. That would change lives in ways I can hardly imagine. Maya glanced toward the window where the afternoon light illuminated the rows of computer desks. Sometimes the most important. Innovations are not the ones we sell to the market, she said quietly. Sometimes they are the ones that give people the tools to build their own futures. Elena nodded with deep understanding. If you decide to help us pursue that vision, this center will stand beside you every step of the way. Maya slipped the folder into her bag and looked once more at the students finishing their projects. She could almost feel the momentum of possibility building in the room. For years, her skills had helped transform Ethan Caldwell's ideas into a thriving company that influenced technology markets around the world. Now those same skills might help build something equally meaningful in a completely different direction. Meanwhile, back at Caldwell Tech headquarters, Ethan Caldwell remained in his office reviewing the final notes from the board meeting while the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the conference table. The discussions with Charlotte Whitman and the board had gone smoothly, yet a quiet distraction lingered at the edge of his thoughts. Maya Brooks still had not returned to the building. Normally, she would have been the first person he consulted after a meeting like this, analyzing every detail of the partnership proposals and offering her perspective on the best path forward. Ethan stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the city. From this height, the skyline looked calm and distant, the movement of traffic forming slow patterns through the streets below. For more than a decade, Maya had been part of nearly every strategic conversation that shaped Caldwell Tech's growth. The idea that she might one day follow a path separate from the company had never seriously crossed his mind. Yet the quiet intuition he felt the night before continued to surface. Ethan picked up his phone and opened the message screen, hesitating briefly before typing a simple question. Are you still across town? The message sent instantly. He placed the phone on the desk and waited while the city outside his window shifted slowly toward evening. Several minutes passed before the screen lit up with Maya's reply. Yes, visiting a community technology program. I will return later tonight to finish preparing the next set of reports. Ethan read the message twice. A community technology program. The phrase seemed unusual compared to the normal language of boardrooms and investment strategies that filled most of their conversations. He typed, another message. Is everything all right? Maya's response arrived moments later. Everything is fine. I just needed to see something important in person. Ethan stared at the words for a moment longer than expected. Something important in person. The sentence carried a quiet weight he could not quite interpret. Meanwhile, the late afternoon sun continued descending across the skyline, casting long reflections across the glass towers of Manhattan. Somewhere across the city, Maya Brooks was beginning to build a vision that reached far beyond the walls of Caldwell Tech, and Ethan Caldwell was slowly realizing that the person who had always stood beside him might soon be stepping into a future neither of them had ever predicted. Evening settled slowly across Manhattan as the last light of the day faded behind the skyline, and inside the Innovation Pathways Learning Center, the quiet hum of computers was replaced by the softer sounds of chairs being stacked and lights switching off for the night. Maya Brooks stood near the front desk with Elena Rodriguez reviewing one final page of notes before closing the folder that held the center's expansion ideas. The students had already left with excited conversations echoing down the sidewalk outside, their backpacks bouncing as they talked about the code they had written and the small robots they had tested. The classroom felt different now in the calm that followed a day full of discovery. The rows of computers glowed faintly in sleep mode, reflecting across the polished floor like quiet reminders of what had happened in the room only hours earlier. Elena leaned lightly against the edge of a desk, while watching Maya gather her notes. I can tell you are thinking seriously about this, she said gently. Most visitors nod politely when they hear about our mission, but they leave without imagining what the future could really look like. Maya placed the folder carefully into her bag and looked around the room once more. For years, she had helped build one of the most powerful technology companies in the country. Yet the energy in this small classroom felt just as meaningful as any boardroom decision she had ever made. These students remind me of something important, Maya replied quietly. Technology should not only belong to the people who can already afford access to it. Elena nodded slowly, understanding the deeper meaning behind Maya's words. When you are ready to talk about what comes next, this center will be here. Maya smiled warmly and shook her hand before stepping outside into the evening air. The streetlights had already flickered on, casting long reflections across the sidewalks while the city continued its endless rhythm of movement. The subway station at the corner hummed with commuters heading home after long workdays, and the distant sound of traffic blended into the steady heartbeat of New York. Maya paused briefly on the sidewalk, looking back at the modest brick building behind her. Earlier that morning, the idea of helping expand programs like this had still been forming quietly in the background of her thoughts. Now it felt real enough to begin planning seriously. Across the city, the lights inside Caldwell Tech headquarters glowed against the darkening sky, while most employees prepared to leave for the evening. Ethan Caldwell remained inside his office reviewing one final document from the board meeting earlier that afternoon. The partnership discussions with the Whitman family had gone smoothly, and investors would likely respond positively once the announcement reached the press. On paper, the future looked secure. Yet the quiet sense of imbalance he had felt throughout the day still lingered in the back of his mind. Maya Brooks had always been part of every step forward the company took. Her absence from the office during such an important day had created a silence Ethan could not easily ignore. He checked his phone again, rereading the brief messages she had sent earlier about visiting a community technology program. Something important in person, she had written. Ethan leaned back in his chair and stared out the window toward the city skyline. For the first time in years, he wondered whether the future of Caldwell Tech might be shifting in a direction he had never fully considered. The thought did not come from fear or anger. Instead, it felt like the quiet realization that some of the most meaningful partnerships in life could evolve into something unexpected. The elevator doors opened softly in the hallway outside his office a few minutes later. Ethan glanced toward the sound just as Maya Brooks walked through the corridor carrying her bag and a small stack of documents. She had returned later than usual, yet her expression remained calm and thoughtful in the same way it had been during countless late nights of work over the years. Ethan stood immediately and stepped into the hallway. Maya looked up with a small smile when she saw him. I thought everyone would already be gone for the night, she said lightly. Ethan returned the smile, though curiosity remained visible in his eyes. I was finishing the board meeting notes. How was your visit across town? Maya paused briefly before answering. Interesting. Ethan folded his arms gently while leaning against the doorway of his office. Interesting is a word you usually reserve for complicated situations. Maya laughed softly. You know me too well. Ethan studied her for a moment longer. Would you mind telling me what you found? Maya stepped closer to the window at the end of the hallway where the city lights shimmered across the glass. I visited a community center that teaches technology skills to students who normally would not have access to programs like that. Ethan listened quietly while she continued. They have built something remarkable with very limited resources. Students are learning coding, robotics, and problem-solving skills that could open entirely new futures for them. Ethan nodded slowly. That sounds like the kind of initiative Caldwell Tech should support through our outreach programs. Maya looked back at him with calm clarity. It could be more than a simple outreach program. Ethan tilted his head slightly. What do you mean? Maya rested her hands lightly against the window railing while choosing her words carefully. I have been thinking about something for a long time. The skills we use to build Caldwell Tech could help create a national network of technology education centers for communities that rarely receive opportunities like that. Ethan watched her closely, recognizing the quiet determination in her voice. You are serious about this idea, he said. Maya nodded. I believe it could change thousands of lives if it is structured correctly. For a moment, neither of them spoke while the lights of the city reflected across the hallway windows. Ethan finally stepped closer. Are you thinking about building something like that through the company? Maya met his gaze calmly. Not exactly. Ethan felt the subtle weight of those words. You mean outside the company? Maya nodded again. I am still working through the details, but I think it might be time for me to focus on a different kind of project. The silence that followed felt deeper than anything either of them had expected when the day began. Ethan looked down the quiet hallway where Maya's office light had been missing all afternoon. For 11 years, she had stood beside him through every stage of Caldwell Tech's growth. The idea that her path might now lead somewhere beyond the company felt both surprising and strangely inevitable. He looked back at her with thoughtful honesty. If this is something you truly believe in, then I know you will build it the same way we built everything else. With patience, intelligence, and a vision that refuses to give up. Maya smiled softly, grateful for the respect in his voice, even though the conversation carried a quiet weight neither of them could ignore. Outside the windows, the city continued moving forward beneath the glow of thousands of lights. And somewhere within that endless skyline, two people who had built a decade of success together were beginning to understand that the next chapter of their lives might lead them in directions they had never expected. The hallway outside the executive offices of Caldwell Tech was almost completely silent as the evening deepened across Manhattan. Most of the employees had already gone home, and the bright rhythm of the workday had faded into the quiet glow of a few remaining office lights. Ethan Caldwell and Maya Brooks still stood near the tall window at the end of the corridor where the city skyline stretched endlessly beneath the night sky. The reflections of thousands of lights shimmered across the glass, creating the illusion that the entire city was moving slowly beneath them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The conversation they had just begun carried a weight that neither had expected when the day started. Maya finally broke the silence, her voice calm but thoughtful. I did not plan to bring this up so quickly, she said quietly. I only went to visit the center because I needed to see whether the idea I had been thinking about was actually possible. Ethan leaned lightly against the window railing while listening. You have been thinking about this for a while, have you not? Maya nodded slowly. Longer than I realized. The past few years I have spent so much time helping the company grow that I almost forgot there were other ways to use the same skills. But when I saw those students today, I realized something important. Ethan studied her expression carefully. You saw a future that mattered to you. Maya met his gaze. Yes, a future where technology does not only belong to people who already have access to it. The students in that program are curious, capable, and determined. They simply need someone to help open the door. Ethan remained quiet for several seconds, absorbing her words while the city lights flickered beyond the glass. For more than a decade, he had relied on Maya to help transform his ideas into reality. She had always been the steady force that balanced ambition with careful strategy. Now he could see that the same determination that built Caldwell Tech was guiding her towards something entirely different. Finally, he spoke. When we started the company, we said we wanted to build technology that made the world better, he said slowly. Maya smiled faintly. I remember. We were sitting in that tiny apartment office with 3 laptops and a coffee machine that sounded like it might explode every time it turned on. Ethan laughed quietly at the memory. And we believed we would change the entire industry, even though most investors would not return our calls. Maya nodded. Those were simpler days in some ways. Ethan looked out over the skyline again. Do you remember the night we signed our first major distribution agreement? Maya leaned against the window beside him. Of course I remember. You ordered pizza for the entire team, even though the company barely had enough money to pay rent that month. Ethan shook his head with a small smile. I was convinced that if we celebrated early success, it would motivate everyone to keep pushing forward. Maya glanced toward him. It worked. The company never slowed down after that. The quiet warmth of shared memories lingered between them for a moment before the conversation returned to the present. Ethan turned back toward her with a thoughtful expression. If you build this program, it will require the same level of commitment you gave to Caldwell Tech. Maya nodded. I understand that. Creating something meaningful on that scale will take years of work, partnerships, and resources. Ethan crossed his arms gently. And you are prepared for that challenge? Maya answered without hesitation. Yes. Ethan considered her response carefully. For 11 years, he had watched her solve problems that would have overwhelmed most executives. She had negotiated complex agreements, built international operations systems, and guided the company through moments of uncertainty that few people outside the leadership team ever knew existed. If anyone could build a national education network from the ground up, He knew Maya Brooks had the discipline to do it. The realization filled him with both pride and an unexpected sense of loss. Caldwell Tech had always felt like a partnership between them, even if the world saw him as the face of the company. He finally spoke again. "If this is the direction you choose, you will have my support," he said quietly. Maya looked at him with genuine appreciation. "That means more than you know." Ethan shook his head slightly. "You do not need my permission to follow your vision. You have earned the right to build whatever future you believe in." Maya studied his expression for a moment, recognizing the mixture of respect and unspoken emotion behind his words. "You helped shape the person who can pursue that future," she said softly. "Everything I learned about building systems and organizations came from the work we did together." Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to the city outside the window where streams of headlights moved along the streets far below. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "There is something else I should say before this conversation goes any further." Maya waited patiently. Ethan drew a slow breath as if organizing thoughts he had never planned to express. "When you first joined the company, I thought you were simply the most organized person I had ever met. Someone who could keep my ideas from collapsing into chaos." Maya laughed gently. "That description is still accurate." Ethan smiled, but his tone remained thoughtful. "Over time I realized you were much more than that. You were the one person who understood what I was trying to build even when I could not explain it clearly." Maya listened without interrupting. Ethan continued slowly. "Somewhere along the way I stopped thinking about Caldwell Tech as my company. It became something we built together." The admission hung quietly in the air between them. Maya felt a familiar warmth in her chest as she absorbed the meaning behind his words. The years they had spent working side by side had created a bond deeper than ordinary professional partnerships. Ethan looked at her again with sincere honesty. "If you decide to follow this new path, the company will not be the same without you." Maya nodded gently. "I know, but that does not mean the company will stop growing. You have built a leadership team that understands the vision now." Ethan allowed himself a small smile. "That sounds exactly like something you would say during a strategic transition meeting." Maya shrugged lightly. Some habits never change. The tension between them softened slightly as the conversation drifted back toward familiar ground. Yet both of them understood that the decision forming in Maya's mind would reshape their lives in ways neither could fully predict. After another moment, Maya stepped away from the window. "I should finish organizing the final reports before tomorrow's investor calls," she said. Ethan nodded but did not move immediately. As she walked toward her office door, he spoke one last time. "Maya." She turned back toward him. "Whatever you decide to build next, I know it will matter to people who need it." Maya smiled warmly before entering her office. The door closed softly behind her, leaving Ethan standing alone beside the window while the endless lights of Manhattan continued glowing beneath the night sky. For the first time since the company began, the future of Caldwell Tech and the future of Maya Brooks were no longer guaranteed to follow the same path, and the realization carried both quiet pride and an unexpected sense of longing. The office lights inside Caldwell Tech glowed softly against the deep blue of the late-night sky as Maya Brooks sat at her desk reviewing the final reports she had promised to organize before morning. The building had grown quiet again, the echo of earlier conversations fading into the calm rhythm that only appeared when most of the city had gone home. Through the glass wall of her office, the skyline of Manhattan stretched endlessly beyond the windows, a sea of lights reflecting across the dark river and the distant bridges. Maya rested her hands lightly on the edge of the desk and looked out across the city for a long moment. 11 years earlier, she had walked into a tiny apartment office with Ethan Caldwell and a handful of engineers who believed they could build something extraordinary with little more than determination and a few borrowed laptops. They had spent countless nights solving problems that seemed impossible at the time, turning small ideas into products that slowly transformed into a company recognized across the world. Those years had shaped her more than any classroom or training program ever could. They had taught her how to build systems that could grow beyond their original vision and how to guide ambitious ideas into reality. Yet the same skills that helped build Caldwell Tech were now quietly pointing her toward a different kind of future. Maya closed the final folder and placed it neatly on the corner of her desk before standing and walking toward the window. The city lights below felt alive with movement even at this late hour. Taxis weaving through intersections, while distant sirens echoed softly through the night. Somewhere out there were thousands of young people who had never imagined they might one day build the technology shaping the world around them. The students she had met earlier that afternoon were only a small example of how powerful curiosity could become when someone simply opened the right door. Behind her in the hallway, Ethan Caldwell remained inside his own office finishing the last messages from investors who had congratulated him on the engagement announcement. His computer screen illuminated the room with a soft glow while the city lights outside formed a quiet reflection across the glass walls. Normally, Ethan thrived in the momentum of growth and opportunity. Yet tonight his thoughts returned again and again to the conversation he had shared with Maya near the window earlier. For years he had never questioned the assumption that she would always be part of the company's future. Her presence had been as constant as the skyline outside his office. Now that certainty had shifted into something less predictable, and the realization carried an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked toward the door separating his office from the hallway. Beyond that door, Maya was finishing the final tasks she had promised to complete before leaving for the night. The quiet knowledge that their partnership might soon change felt strangely heavier than any business challenge he had faced before. After a few minutes, he stood and walked slowly toward the corridor. The hallway lights reflected across the polished floor while the building remained almost completely silent. When he reached Maya's office, the glass door was still open, and he could see her standing beside the window looking out across the skyline. She turned slightly when she heard his footsteps. Ethan paused just inside the doorway. "I thought you might have left already," he said softly. Maya smiled gently. "I wanted to finish organizing the reports so tomorrow starts smoothly for the team." Ethan glanced toward the folders stacked neatly on her desk. "You have always taken care of details most people never notice." Maya shrugged lightly. "Someone has to keep the foundation steady while everyone else builds on top of it." Ethan stepped closer to the window where she had been standing. The view stretched across the city in brilliant layers of light and shadow. For a moment, they both watched the skyline without speaking, the quiet familiarity of shared silence returning just as it had during countless late nights over the past decade. Finally, Ethan spoke again. "When we started Caldwell Tech, I thought success would feel like reaching the top of a mountain." Maya looked at him with curiosity. "And now?" Ethan considered the question carefully. "Now it feels more like standing at the edge of a wide landscape, where there are still many directions left to explore." Maya nodded slowly. "That sounds about right." Ethan turned slightly toward her. "I meant what I said earlier. If you build this education program, you will change more lives than any single product we ever launched." Maya studied his expression and recognized the sincerity in his voice. "That means a lot coming from you." Ethan smiled faintly. "You helped shape the way I think about the world. It is only fair that I support the path you believe in now." The words settled quietly between them, carrying the warmth of years spent building trust. Maya felt a gentle wave of gratitude that he understood the deeper purpose behind her decision. She looked back out across the skyline where the lights of the city continued glowing against the night. "I am not leaving everything behind immediately," she said thoughtfully. "There is still work to finish here and a leadership team to prepare for the next chapter of the company." Ethan nodded. "That sounds exactly like the kind of transition you would design." Maya laughed softly. "Some habits really do stay with us forever." The sound of her laughter filled the quiet office for a moment before fading into the calm of the evening. Ethan looked at her again with an expression that carried both pride and something deeper he had never fully expressed before. "There is one more thing I have realized during this conversation," he said slowly. Maya turned toward him. "What is that?" Ethan hesitated for a brief second before continuing. "I spent years believing that the most important partnership in my life was the company we built together. But tonight I realized that the partnership itself mattered even more than the company." Maya felt a quiet warmth in her chest at the honesty of his words. The truth was that their connection had always existed beyond job titles or boardroom decisions. They had grown together through every challenge and success the company faced. Some bonds were built through time and trust rather than simple definitions. Maya met his gaze with calm clarity. "No matter where our work takes us next, that partnership does not disappear." Ethan nodded gently. "I know." Outside the window, the endless lights of Manhattan continued stretching toward the horizon, a reminder that every city was filled with countless stories unfolding at once. Some stories followed familiar paths, while others opened unexpected possibilities that no one could predict in advance. For Ethan Caldwell and Maya Brooks, the future no longer looked exactly like the one they had imagined during the early days of Caldwell Tech. Yet the respect and understanding they had built over 11 years remained stronger than any uncertainty about what came next. Maya gathered her bag from the desk and walked toward the door. "I should head home before the subway schedule gets complicated," she said lightly. Ethan walked with her into the hallway. The quiet building felt almost peaceful now that the long day had finally reached its end. As they reached the elevator doors, Maya turned back toward him with a small smile. "Thank you for listening tonight." Ethan returned the smile. "Thank you for reminding me that success is not only measured by what we build for ourselves, but also by what we create for others." The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Maya stepped inside. As the doors closed, she looked up at him one last time. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Maya," he replied gently. The elevator descended quietly toward the lobby, while Ethan remained standing in the hallway watching the empty space where the doors had just closed. Outside the glass windows, the city continued shining with endless possibility, and somewhere within that vast skyline, the next chapter of their lives was already beginning to take shape.